Welcome to the Gamut of Performance Podcast, episode 26. On this episode of the podcast, I get to talk with Zac Cupples. To put it simply, Zac and I dive into movement. We talk about faulty movement strategies. We talk about movement limitations. We talk about breathing and how it can affect movement. If you're a practitioner that works with people that want to improve their movement, or you're just someone that wants to improve their movement on their own, this is the podcast for you. So without further ado, here is Zac Cupples. Zac Cupples, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you being on. I've heard a lot of good things about you. I've been following you for a little while now. And so for the listeners at home, will you tell us just a little bit about your background, your motivation, and where you are currently?
Sure. So I'm a physical therapist by training, also a strength conditioning coach. I've been doing this for about 7 years now. It means I'm starting to date myself, getting old. I currently am working as a traveling physical therapist, or as I like to tell people, a mercenary in a small town in California called Susanville. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I'm attracted to that is because in small towns I can actually practice the way I want to. So that's why I'm there with that. Motivation. The reason why I got in this field is because and I'm sure it's probably like a lot of people who've been on your podcast, I was not a great athlete by any means. Okay. I had worked my tail off to try to be good at cross country and track and field. Those were my sports in high school and college. And like my biggest pride was always winning, or like winning most improved in both high school and college, because it showed that I had to put in that work to get to the next level. And one of the things I did to get to the next level was get into strength conditioning. And as soon as I started lifting, I just fell in love with that. And I'm like, man, we can really help a lot of people with performance by using this modality. And then I kind of got into physical therapy and on the rehab side of things, and I saw the exact same thing. It's like, oh, wow, we get these same qualities, and we can help the people who are in pain or who are suffering from some type of issue also get better by movement. And that's really what drives me. It's using as many non-surgical or less deleterious, potentially deleterious methods to help people reach their health and performance goals. And that's what's pushing me to dive into a lot of things beyond movement, whether it's learning more about sleep, learning about functional medicine, nutrition, learning about distress management. Like, I think all of these things are what drive me to help people reach their goals at a more natural and less conventional method.
Okay. And so you kind of mentioned how you call yourself a mercenary because you work in smaller towns. What restrictions might you see in a larger area?
You have to see more patients.
Okay.
I think because when you work in a larger city, you have larger taxes. You have, rent is more expensive. And because of that, and with the decline in insurance reimbursement, generally people have to make ends meet, see way more patients in a given hour. Okay. Me, I'm very fortunate. I get to see one patient every 45 minutes because the demands are much less in a town of 17,000 or whatever it is where I live. So it'll be like that until I decide to go out on my own, which is hopefully sooner rather than later.
Fair enough. That makes total sense. So you mentioned a little bit about your sport background in cross country and track, right? So will you expand on how you got connected with the NBA and your time there?
Sure. I think like most people who get into pro sports, it's because you know someone. So I had a friend who knew a friend who interviewed with this team, didn't want to go with them, and then eventually I got the opportunity to interview and work for the Memphis Grizzlies and the Iowa Energy, which would be their NBA and their D-League affiliate at the time. I know it's the G-League now, but it's the D-League back when I was in it. And that's really how I got in on that. And so I started with the Grizzlies mid-season 2015, I think. Mid-season 2015, so the 2015-16 season. Worked with them in a predominantly doing kind of corrective work / strength and conditioning. So I would set up corrective exercise programs for a lot of the players, do some strength conditioning and a little bit of rehabilitation with some of them. And that was my first year. And then the second year, after we did the summer strength conditioning with the Grizzlies, I went to Iowa and I basically headed the D-League program there. So I took care of physical therapy, I took care of strength conditioning, I took care of nutrition, I took care of sleep. I got to do some really cool things with travel. I got to be able to determine hey, coach, we should practice at this time on this day.
Mm-hmm.
So guys can get as much sleep as possible, because we had 2 6 a.m. flights back to back that we are dying from.
Yeah.
And so I'm very fortunate to work with a coach who was very, who kind of gave me the reins. And it was really that experience that kind of shaped how I practice now, and from a multimodal approach, because we had to, in that setting, we had to do everything in our power to try to help these guys perform at the highest level possible. It's something that I still try to exude and utilize to this day.
Okay, fair enough. No, that's really interesting. In terms of the sleep and nutrition aspect, did you do anything, or what did that kind of look like?
So from the sleep standpoint, a lot of it was managing when we had practice. I couldn't necessarily manage what times we left, because when you're in the D League, you're basically going with the cheapest flights possible.
Yeah.
Another possibility might be if we had to bus a place, when we would bus, if we would bus the night and sleep over, if we would get a sleeper bus, those types of things. But really the way that I manipulated it the most would be timing of practice. We had one coach in the beginning of our year where we practiced mostly in the mornings, and morning practices coupled with sleep deprivation from travel led to disaster. We had a terrible record, a lot of injuries. It was not good. Once we got a new coach, we elected to move the practices to the afternoon so the guys could sleep in. Once that happened, I mean, it was just like a flick of the switch. Guys were less angry and stressed at one another.
Yeah.
We started winning more. We saw injuries go down. I mean, it was a very, very cool experience. So that's kind of how I manipulated it.
Okay.
And the nutrition aspect was just basically I would try to provide these guys food options that were healthy. So we would get some type of catering after practice sometimes. We would get orders from different restaurants where we had a little bit more healthy options. I tried to educate those guys on healthy options, designing meal plans, anything I could do to support these guys and moving them towards a healthier lifestyle.
Okay. So what suggestions would you have on adapting to, say, the culture of basketball as a support staff in your many different roles?
What do you mean by culture? Could you expand on that just a little bit more?
Yeah, no problem. So in basketball, typically, for example, like weights is not necessarily an integral part, or the guys don't necessarily like, having to train or things like that. They're more focused on, playing the game. And so the culture in the regard that the training piece is not necessarily set yet.
Yeah. Okay. I got you. I think the biggest thing in adapting to the culture in that regard is you have to gain their trust first and foremost.
Okay.
So you got to let them know that you are there for them. And maybe it's not, hey, I want you to come into the weight room and I'm going to force you to do this, but it could be something as simple as just having a chat with them while they're eating, or hey, you need a red line before you go play. I'm going to go grab that for you. And let me just ask about your family and all these things.
Okay.
Because I think with a lot of the guys, when there's money involved, you get a lot of people in their lives who want to be associated with them because they're an NBA player, they got a lot of money, they have things to offer. So I get why they may not trust someone who's new and is also potentially trying to get a piece of the pie from them.
Okay.
I think you see a lot of people, even on, you go to Instagram and someone works with someone famous, well, you most certainly will know that they work with that famous person.
Yeah, agreed.
Right? So why isn't it the same for the people in the league? So I think if you can gain their trust, let them know that you're trying to help them in their best interest, not necessarily force them to do anything, but say, hey, man, here's what I can offer you, or is there anything else I can do for you? Then I think that you have a much better chance of getting them to buy into your programming than if you're not a good dude with them. What also helps, though, is getting results. And so some of the stuff that I'm sure we'll talk about later, you can get results for people who are in pain or who have movement limitations very quickly if you know how to coach some of the stuff that I talk about. And that's also a great way to get buy-in and shape the culture.
Yeah. Okay. No, I like it. So let's transition a little bit, and let's talk about some asymmetry and imbalance in sport, right? So a lot of times that's what makes athletes successful, but what's the cost versus the benefit here? So when do we intervene?
I I think, and this probably piggyback on what we just talked about,
Mm-hmm.
but as strength conditioning coaches, as clinicians,
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to be humble in what we can and can't do.
Mm.
I'll give you an example. I think over the years, a lot of people come back to Usain Bolt,
Mm-hmm.
how he runs very asymmetrically,
Mm-hmm.
like just lives on his right leg,
Yeah.
and he sustains a hamstring injury.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was like it might have been his last race or one of his last races.
Mm-hmm.
And you saw this flood on social media of people saying, oh, well, if he had done my training like this, he probably wouldn't have had that hamstring injury.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if he wasn't the fastest man in the world doing one of the most violent and aggressive things
Yeah.
possible, he may not have had that injury too.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think we have to consider that maybe some of the things that we do
Mm-hmm.
might not always transfer to that high level activity.
Mm.
And it may be that you do something that's a lower level, whether it's some type of breathing exercise like I might do,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe it's like an FMS corrective.
Mm-hmm.
You might get a change in that context,
Okay.
or in some of the context of your tests.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that it's going to manifest in the sprint,
Mm-hmm.
or in the sport, or even in the weight room.
Mm.
Because we're talking three different things in that case. We're talking different movement strategies required. We're talking a different environment, competition versus a controlled environment in the weight room versus a maybe low stress environment of me interacting with a athlete on a table.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do we know that these things would transfer amongst one another?
Mm-hmm.
So, well, we can say that maybe we can address some of these asymmetries that maybe guys like us would work with,
Mm-hmm.
Juan Carlos, whether it's table stuff or whether it's weight room stuff. I highly doubt that we're going to do anything that's super impactful in terms of the terminal task, which is sport.
Mm-hmm.
Now, where it might be cost versus benefit would be if, say, someone has something funky with their golf swing,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe they're still doing really well, but maybe a skilled swing coach
Mm-hmm.
can pinpoint that if we tweak this and this, they might get even more mileage out of that swing.
Mm.
Like there, I think, is something meaningful when we're talking about altering asymmetry in that regard.
Yeah.
Or even pitching mechanics. Sure, this person might not have all the rotation that they need on their left shoulder if they're a right-handed pitcher, but maybe a pitch coach can do something that takes advantage of some of the movement limitations that they have or alters the movement limitations that they have, and that allows them to move the needle in terms of their performance without deleterious effects.
Mm.
So I would say, to summarize that, when you're addressing asymmetry, realize that there's a different context depending on when you address the asymmetry. We don't always know that there's going to be carryover among contexts, and the person who's going to know best in terms of cost versus benefit is the professional who deals with that specific thing. So if it's a sprint coach and you're working with a sprinter, it's the sprint coach.
Mm-hmm.
If it's something in the weight room, Juan Carlos, it's you. If it's something in a rehab standpoint, it's probably me.
That makes sense. Okay. So you kind of touched a little bit on the FMS, right? So in today's day and age, especially in the college realm, there's a lot of people that are in love with correctives and assessments. And so, I mean, I'm not necessarily taking a side one way or another, but what's your take on say, the FMS and correctives and implementing those?
Sure. So I'll preface my knowledge base of the FMS.
Mm-hmm.
I'm fairly versed in their material. I've taken the FMS level 1 and level 2.
Okay.
I've done the SFMA, so I have at least a rudimentary understanding of what they do.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that I use.
Okay.
And I think when we're talking about the FMS, like, it still comes back to context in that regard. I know Stuart McGill is not a huge proponent of the FMS, if you've listened to some of his stuff. And the reason why is because it doesn't transfer to load-based activities.
Mm-hmm.
A screen like the FMS is one particular movement context. Loaded activities, same thing. Sprinting, same thing. So to say where the transfer is among these tasks is really hard for me to make a claim in that regard.
Mm.
But I could also say the same thing about my assessment that I utilize.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if someone can achieve desirable outcomes with the FMS,
Mm-hmm.
and by that I mean they're getting changes on that, it's carrying over to some task that's meaningful for the client, then I'm not offended by it by any means. But I think a lot of times, from what I've seen with some of the implementation of the FMS, is we do the FMS, we throw a bunch of correctives to try to improve the FMS, and either the correctives are coached poorly, i.e. there is a poor execution, or maybe the correctives were not the best ones to choose based on intent, or worst off, we never remeasure the FMS, and then we don't know if we're achieving the outcome so desired, or we're doing things in the program that don't complement what we're trying to change. So I think the biggest problem that I have with it is that we have the problem of context. We have the problem of is it testing what we think it needs to test, and I think that there's a lot of poor implementation of it. But if you can get desirable outcomes that are helpful for your client, I don't see why the FMS is a problem. It's just not something I use because I use my assessment that I feel more comfortable with, and I feel like I get more information out of.
Okay. Will you touch on your assessment a little bit?
Sure. So when we look at, if we compare that versus the FMS, the FMS is a very gross screen. So while you can change gross movement patterns, you might not be able to appreciate the finer details in terms of how someone moves. For example, if I'm doing the inline lunge, there's a possibility that the reason why a person can't do an inline lunge is because of ankle dorsiflexion restriction on the front leg. It could be because they can't get into adduction of the hips on either side. It could be because of some type of shoulder mobility limitation where they can't hold the stick. I mean, there's just a lot of possible reasons why that is. What my assessment entails is breaking that down.
Okay.
What I look at is I look at just about every joint in the human body, and I want to see if that person has full movement capabilities in all of those joints. So we're talking shoulders, we're talking rib cage, we're talking hips, we're talking elbows, neck, everything. And my hope with that is I'm trying to restore someone's movement capabilities or movement options across all of those joints. So if someone lacks shoulder range of motion on one side and hip range of motion on the other, theoretically, at least from a table standpoint, that person may not be able to achieve those joint positions in another context. Now, I'm making a little bit of a leap there based on some of the stuff that I said before because we don't know how things transfer. But if you're working with me, and typically that's someone in pain, that's what I have to use because it's a bit more convenient. Right? So I try to look at all of those joints. That gives me a picture in terms of what movement availability that person has, and then I select interventions that try to restore those movement limitations. Okay. And then it's a matter of progressing someone up to loaded activities and then terminal task, whatever that is.
Okay. So on these assessments, say the FMS, right, or something similar, how many times do you think practitioners or strength coaches have a issue of more of weakness or versus true dysfunction? And how do you think that we can be better at differentiating the two?
Yeah. Well, I have a little bit of a hard time with both of these terms.
Okay.
First off, weakness. If I have someone who, let's say, has a movement limitation, maybe I have someone who can't get full hip extension. Say, is the glute really weak, or is it that because of movement limitations present in that area, I can't get full concentric activity of the glute max because I don't have access to full hip extension?
Okay. Yeah.
The only time I think you have legitimate weakness is if there's a nerve injury at play. And that would be something you would have to tease out via a neurological examination. That's probably more of a medical thing. Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough.
Because, like if you can get someone to do a goblet squat or a kettlebell deadlift or something, are they really weak? Yeah. Probably not. And then I also have a hard time with dysfunction.
Okay.
Because is it really dysfunctional, or is it that the body and all of the systems in the body has decided that whatever strategy that person is using at that given time is probably the best strategy that that person could use to ensure survival in the given task.
Okay.
I'll give you an example. Let's say you are someone who is chronically stressed. You have your spouse is abusive. You live in a low socioeconomic area. You just lost your job. Blah 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 blah. If you develop hypertension in that case, high blood pressure, that's, even though that's not a desirable thing to happen, that's probably a good adaptation to occur because you are chronically stressed. So we may as well raise your set point to be able to cope with those stressors.
Yeah.
We could apply the same principle to movement.
Okay.
Maybe that person lacks or can't squat because they have a huge arch in their lower back and they have limitations in hip extension. Well, maybe based on some of the internal and external forces that that person's undergoing, maybe given some of the movement environments that they've been exposed to, both birth to 3 and then all the way up, that the body has decided that that is the best strategy to ensure that that person stays upright, survives all of the environments that they're in, and thrives.
Yeah.
So I think it's very tough to differentiate either of those things. Weakness, obviously nerve injury.
Yeah.
Dysfunction, probably not the best word, but I think what you could discern is someone moving in what we would determine is like best practice for that move.
Yeah.
So, squat, for example. Am I keeping the implement over my midfoot? Am I keeping the spine neutral? And I'll put that in scare quotes because there's not such a thing as neutral spine. But do the movements that we're coaching look pretty?
Yeah.
Does someone on the table have access to all of their joint range of motion? Those would be the things that I would be looking at, and that's really how you can discern things. One, does a person have the movement options available to be able to perform a task, which would be passive range of motion? And two, can they execute that task, which would be your eye test of does the movements that I'm coaching look pretty? And that's really where you need to, I think, put your decision-making process.
Okay.
Coach.
That makes sense. And so how many times, on an assessment or in a movement, or how many times do you think dysfunctional breathing can cause false positives in other tests?
Well, I mean,
I know you don't like the word dysfunction, so.
Yes. Darn it, man. Yeah. I think, and this is my bias creeping in, I think that breathing has to be one of the first things that we have to check with our people. And the reason why I say that is because all of the joints in your body are involved every time you take a breath of air in and out. There is a gross expansion and compression of the thoraco-abdominal pelvic cavity. That's a mouthful. Every time you take a breath of air in and a breath of air out.
Yeah.
And all the joints have to accommodate in order for that to happen. So what breathing strategy one of your clients utilizes, that could potentially be a contributing factor to the movement limitations that an individual may or may not possess. Because the breathing is going to be the top priority for your body.
Yeah.
If you can't get air in adequately, you will die. So it's probably important to mobilize yourself in a manner that maximizes that. So I think that measuring and looking at breathing strategy is incredibly important and has to be taken care of before you consider any movement limitations as being like something locally within a joint. And I find that if you do a lot of the stuff that I've done, rarely is there something that's a local impairment if you are taking respiration into account.
Okay. So what is your strategy on attacking breathing, say, disorders, or what would you use as that term?
Strategies.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's all strategies because, like I said, hypertension is a strategy that your body uses to deal with things.
Okay.
Autoimmunity is a strategy. We could say the same thing about movement limitations. These are strategies that our clients are using to cope.
Okay.
A lot of the way that I assess breathing predominantly occurs through my entire assessment. The big test for me that I have to give credit to Bill Hartman to, who's kind of opened my eyes with this, is the infrasternal angle. What that test is if you take your finger, your thumb, and you find the rubbery portion below your sternum, which is your xiphoid process, and you create an outline of the rib cage.
Yeah.
That will tell you what your infrasternal angle is.
Okay.
Now, in a perfect world, and I don't want to say a perfect world, but you can have individuals, if we use 90 as kind of like the gold standard, which rarely is not the case. Really what the case is like a dynamic rib cage, which is you want that angle to be mobile. What you'll have with some people is they'll either have a very wide angle, which would be much greater than 90 degrees, or they will have a very narrow angle, which would be much less than 90 degrees. You can also have an asymmetrical angle where one side is more on the narrow side of things, and the other side is more wide on those side of things. And a lot of times that will correlate with movement limitations across most every joint. And that's really the first place that I look, is can that individual have a dynamic lower rib cage? Right? Okay. And so we'll choose exercises or breathing activities or coaching breathing in a particular manner to allow that dynamic capability to be restored. That would be the first piece.
Okay.
The second piece that I would look at as well simultaneously would be hip range of motion, predominantly hip extension and adduction. Depending on what strategy of a rib cage position I'm utilizing in the lower ribs, that will impact what's going on down in the pelvis. Okay. There's an angle in the pelvis called the infrapubic angle. So if you look at the front of your pelvis where the pubic symphysis is, which is like, if I take the two hips or the pelvi and I combine them together, that middle point is the pubic symphysis. There's an angle below that. That would be your infrapubic angle. When movement limitations are present, that angle will match the infrasternal angle.
Oh, okay.
However, you don't want to measure that because you'll get sued.
Fair enough, yeah.
So, yeah, and I don't think you can really. But what you can look at is how well does an individual move their hips. And so a lot of times what you'll see are limitations in hip extension and hip adduction. So I'm taking that into account based on what the infrasternal angle says and what hip limitations I see, and I'm addressing those simultaneously. And what that does for me is it tells me how well does the canister mechanism between the diaphragm and the pelvic floor, how well does that do what it needs to do. And if I can get dynamic action of the lower rib cage, i.e. the bucket handle effect, and I can get dynamic action in the pelvis, which would be improvements in hip mobility, then I know we have at least gotten a good relationship respiratory-wise in the lower thorax and the abdominal pelvic region. So that would be one thing.
Okay. And before you go on, will you just expand on what the bucket handle effect is for some of the listeners who may not know?
Absolutely. Yeah, good question. So bucket handle has to do with the way the rib cage moves when you take a breath of air in. Okay. So as I breathe in, the lower ribs predominantly, although it does happen in the upper ribs, but the lower ribs will move upward and outward, so laterally. Okay. So you get wider every time you take a breath of air in. That's the bucket handle effect of the rib cage. So as I breathe in, it should go up and out. As I breathe out, it should go down and in.
Gotcha. Okay.
And that would probably segue into some of the upper thorax stuff. The other two mechanical things that should happen in the rib cage are the pump handle action, and then the posterior thorax should expand. Okay. Pump handle occurs predominantly in the front portion of the rib cage, where the sternum is. And just like a pump handle, if you're out on the farm, when I breathe in, that front portion of the rib cage should move forward and upward. Okay. And then in the back, the posterior thorax, when I breathe in, should move backward and upward. So it's the combination of all of those actions that leads to that expansion of the entire cavity and compression of the entire cavity.
Okay.
Yep. And the way I'm looking at those two things, pump handle activity and posterior thorax expansion, is by measuring shoulder range of motion.
Okay.
Because if I can or cannot get air into certain chambers of the chest wall, the scapula is going to sit a bit differently compared to if I could get air in those chambers, and that's going to impact the orientation of the shoulder in terms of what muscles will be more concentrically active or short versus eccentrically active, and those can manifest into movement limitations as well.
Okay. No, that's really interesting. I haven't quite heard of the infrasternal angle or any of that stuff, so that was really really interesting. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, man.
And then kind of moving forward with that, right? So how can we use some of these strategies and these tests to work with athletes that have back issues or say a disc issue? Kind of going off of Stuart McGill, I think this was in his writings, of how many people actually have an undiagnosed disc issue, right? And so a lot of athletes will come in and they'll have something going on, whether it's a disc or whether they don't know, or whether it was something that should have been resolved a while ago that still kind of bothers them. How do we kind of handle all this?
Well, first off, in regards to discs, I think we have to be very, very clear when we're educating people on what that means, because, well, Dr. McGill may say that a lot of people have undiagnosed disc issues. You can also have a large case where you can have people who have confirmed on MRI bulging discs and not necessarily pain. I think the one study that I'm aware of is anywhere between 36 to 80% of people who have no back pain, so pain-free, have some type of abnormality on imaging, i.e. a disc. So I think we have to be careful about what we're saying is potentially a disc issue. On the flip side of that, even if someone has an MRI that's confirmed to be a disc bulge, well, there's a study that came out, I think in the last 2 years, it may have been this year, where they took one patient and they had 10 different radiologists look at the MRI imaging of this person's back and come up with a diagnosis. Can you guess how many different diagnoses were given for that image?
Oh,
10
man.
radiologists.
Yeah, I can only imagine, because, I mean, in simple terms of say even an ACL issue, right? I've seen so many different diagnoses. So, what was the actual result?
49.
Wow! Oh my goodness. Okay.
I didn't even know there could be that many things wrong in the lower back.
Yeah.
So I think we have to look at the clinical picture along with imaging to really make informed decisions, because I think a lot of people will just get an MRI and say they have a disc bulge.
Yeah.
But there's no numbness or tingling down the leg, or no anesthesia in the saddle region. That's my little soapbox on disc bulges.
Okay.
But in terms of your question, in terms of working with athletes who have back issues, really with the approach that I utilize, if we're trying to just maximize movement options, which all of the stuff that I was talking about in terms of my baseline assessment is simply that. Person can't get into these joint positions. Let's see if we can do things to help restore the possibility of getting into those joint positions. And a lot of times life is good.
Yeah.
The same approach would occur with someone who has back pain.
Okay.
So what you're doing is you're making sure that they have full respiratory capabilities. They have the bucket handle intact. They can get air into the chest. They can get air into the back. They can appreciate full hip range of motion. And a lot of times that can do wonders. I think, as something that just about anyone could apply to anyone who's got back pain, that's really low risk, would be just focusing on making sure you can try to restore that respiratory mechanism yourself. And a lot of that is just how you're performing breathing. One thing that I will give a lot of people will be just focusing on the breath cycle. I won't do this like when someone's lifting or something like that, but just teaching this strategy a lot of times can lead to movement limitations improving, and it would be getting a full exhale once you've gotten all the air out, pausing, and then upon the inhale, making sure the lower rib cage stays still. And if you do that, you'll feel like you're going to suffocate because you're pushing air into areas that are a little bit more restricted.
Yeah.
but two, because you're pushing air into areas where it's restricted, that could potentially reduce some of the concentric activity of some muscles, restore movement options in some of the areas where there's limitations, and that may take some pressure and strain off of some areas that hurt. And low back is a prime example of that.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's really good. I like that. I mean, breathing's so important. I think a lot of us overlook it, especially those of us that are working with larger groups. We take it for granted that people know how to breathe already, when many times that's not the case. It's causing a lot of upper trap tension and a lot of stress reactions, and so I think this is super important for people to kind of dive into and look at a little bit closer. So I like that. And then kind of moving forward, right? And you kind of touched on it, of how breathing can affect muscle function. But what is your take on stretching, right? So a lot of people, there was a big debate before, and it kind of went away, and now it's like timing of stretching can be important, and that's less in terms of, in my opinion, static stretching before athletic competition, but more in terms of, can stretching blunt effects of, say, sprint training or plyo training, or are we even overstretching? Everyone wants to stretch until the point of, oh man, that's not enough. We need to feel some type of pain. So what's your take on all this?
Yeah, that's a good question, Juan Carlos. I would say, I think in most cases, stretching probably isn't harmful. If you look at some of the research on what it physically takes to create a change within muscle length, it doesn't really happen. Like, you can stretch for a very long period of time and there will be no change in muscle length. What really changes is just your tolerance to stress or to stretch, or pain perception when you're doing that. So is it really something that's problematic? I don't know. There is also some research out there showing that light stretching can improve HRV numbers.
Okay. So
you could have a positive autonomic influence just from stretching. So is that bad? Well, maybe it blunts the effects of or maybe it blunts your performance, which I know there's also been some research on that, but maybe it helps you recover a bit more effectively too. I think where the problem is we all have multiple ways that we choose to work with people. We have, Juan Carlos, I'm sure you have things that are your bread and butter. I have things that are my bread and butter. Someone else is going to have things that are theirs, and we all get results. The question that we have to say is, in regards to something like stretching, is, do we have a good rationale for utilizing that specific modality?
Yeah.
Maybe someone can't touch their toes and they feel the need to stretch to get that last little bit. Well, is that the reason you can't touch your toes? Is because you have a lack of stretch tolerance to be able to get there? Are you looking at other possibilities to change that? Or maybe you're someone who's using stretching to improve HRV scores, or for autonomic whatever. Are you measuring HRV pre and post to know you're getting a change? Are you seeing a change in heart rate variability across weeks' time? Like, I think that's probably the biggest problem with stretching, or anything for that matter, is people implement things without having good rationale or a good retest system to know things are working, and that they have a good reason for doing those things. But like I mentioned with pro athletes, I think a lot of the methods that we use, while can be very powerful for some people, are probably not going to break someone. Yeah.
Okay. No, that makes sense. I like that approach, So kind of moving forward, what are some resources that have had a big impact on you, whether it's a book, a podcast, or like a seminar, or anything of that sort?
Oh gosh, I got so many. Well, so after I was let go by the Grizzlies, I kind of had to have a come to Jesus moment with myself. And I read 4 books that were incredibly impactful.
Okay.
Am I allowed to swear on this?
Yeah, hey, go for it. I mean, just whatever, just kind of speak freely.
Well, the reason why I'm saying that is the titles. Like, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, that was a very impactful book. Extreme Ownership, like, that was life-changing, by Jocko Willink. And then The Ego is the Enemy and The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday.
Okay.
I think those are must-reads for people about just making sure you take ownership of your situation, your destiny, and you are humble and approach life in a way that helps push you towards your goals and helps you be better connected with people as opposed to isolating yourself and having an ego.
Yeah.
I would say those are some of the biggest things that were impactful for me. So it's more life books than I would say it is PT or strength conditioning books, because that's really, I haven't found any book that's like, this is the must read, like I'm going to take so much from these things or podcasts. I think what I recommend most people do is consume a wide amount of information, not just books and podcasts, but also research. Take what's meaningful for you and your clients and build upon that. Or what's probably even better is if you have someone who has a specific problem that you need to solve. So let's say you're having a hard time having someone perform a push-up. Well, if I were you, I would try to read up everything I can on a push-up, whether that's books, whether that's listening to podcasts, or whether that's research to see what you're missing. And then, one, you'll probably solve that person's problem, but two, you'll have a very thorough understanding of what it takes to have a good push-up, in the sense that you'll probably educate others and then make something that transcends all of those references.
Yeah. No, that's a good approach. And then kind of moving into this last segment here, right? So just a few rapid fire questions. So the first one, what are some quotes that you live by, if you have any?
First quote would be from my mentor, Daddy-O Pops Bill Hartman, and that's, don't get married, don't have kids, don't buy a house. And I think it's a really good quote, because the reason why I get a lot of stuff done is because I don't have those things. And it's just I've made my professional life a very high priority. So that would be a quote that I definitely live by.
Okay.
The other quote that I really like is from Jocko Willink, and that's discipline equals freedom. I think a lot of us try to get motivated to do a lot of things, and that doesn't last very long whatsoever, because motivation will wax and wane. But if you are disciplined in your craft, militant, you make sure you make the things that are important to you a part of your daily routine, you can get a lot of stuff done with that. And so the more disciplined you are on the front end, the more freedom you'll have in the back end. So I think those would probably be two of the biggest quotes that are impactful for me.
No, those are really good, and I think a lot of people need to hear those. But moving forward with it, so what's the best advice you've ever been given? It's a tough question. Yeah.
It is a tough question. Be yourself. Be the best version of yourself. I think it's very easy, especially with social media and societal pressures and all of these things, to try to give in to the crowd and what everyone else is doing conventionally. But if you do that, if you go with the crowd, a lot of times you're going to miss out on living life the way you want to, but also a lot of opportunities. I can't remember who this was, but maybe it was Warren Buffett. I don't know. But someone who said, if people are investing in this option, then you probably need to invest in the exact opposite option to get results. Yeah. So I think that's probably been the best advice, is to try to just, become the best version of myself and live life the way I want to.
Okay. So in contrast to that, what's the worst advice you've ever been given?
The worst advice that I've ever been given is, to quit.
Okay.
I've heard, or someone telling me I can't do something. Like, I remember in college, my family was very frustrated with me because I was trying to do well in school, but also trying to be a very good runner. And so most of my time was doing those things. Yeah. And they told me I could be either one or the other. And had I given into that, I probably wouldn't have gotten the experiences, the life enrichment, the health benefits, or gone down the path that I have. So I think that would probably be the worst advice I was ever given, was to only pick one. It goes back to living the life you want to live. Yeah. And that's how I'll always operate.
I like that. Okay. So what's one of the biggest struggles you've had to overcome? Or if I had to rephrase that, what's an event or something that's happened in your life that has caused a lot of effect now? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Man, I mean, there's so many. I've been through some stuff, man.
Yeah.
I think one of the hardest things more recently was getting fired. That's the first time that ever happened, and that was in the NBA, because it was like, wow, I worked so hard to, live in or work in a dream job that most people would be enviable of, and I beat myself up for a while that, like, well, this was my fault, I screwed this up. But at the same time too, anytime something bad usually happens in my life, it kind of lights a fire in me, and it motivates me to do better. Like, so that experience, while it sucked in the short term, was good for me in the long term, because I had to reflect upon myself, who I was as a person, and I made some really good changes for that. It pushed me to start really growing my website and my online services, and it's like now even though I'm not working with pro athletes, I get to work with people all across the world online. I get to teach seminars, and I've always loved teaching, and that was something that I was missing while I was in the league. And I'm less of a miserable person to be around.
Yeah,
so I think, like, even though it sucked then, it was just a lot of good things that came from it, and I wouldn't trade that experience for anything.
Okay. So this last kind of question, so what are some projects you're currently working on, and how can people kind of reach out to you and follow your journey?
Yeah. Biggest project I'm working on right now is my seminar series called Human Matrix. It has to be said that way, and you have to do the dodging of the bullets every time you say it.
I love it.
Yeah. So that's been kind of the biggest thing that I've been working on this last year, and I had my first one in Seattle this last month. Got really good reviews from people. I got a few more coming up this next year. I got Kansas City in a couple weeks. I got Portland, Oregon, November 10th and 11th, and I got Charleston, South Carolina in December 8th and 9th, and we're going to New Jersey February 2nd and 3rd. So that's been the biggest thing that I've been working on right now. I want to make sure that is watertight, that I'm getting people what they want out of those things, and I'm trying to make it the most practical seminar there is. So instead of just spewing a bunch of theory and hoping for the best, we do well at mixing theory with practical application and alternating between those things. So people not only have a good why, but they know how.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's my current big project, besides running my blog and working with people online through movement consultations. So working with people to restore some of the movement limitations that I discussed. I do mentoring, so much like we discussed a lot of these questions. I do mentoring to try to help problem solve through some of these things, and help people implement some of the stuff that I implement. And then I also offer online training, which hopefully helps bridge those contexts that we discuss between training and rehab.
Okay. Awesome. So is the best way to reach you, is it through your website, or is it through like social media, or what would you say?
I would love if you sent people to zaccupples.com, my website. Okay. The place where you're probably going to get the most up-to-date information is if you subscribe to my newsletter on there. So on the right-hand side, just type in your email, you'll get a bunch of free stuff. You'll get like 4.5 hours of me blabbing about breathing and pain. You'll get acute chronic workload calculator. You get all types of cool stuff. That's probably the best way. You can also find me on Facebook. I do live shows on Facebook every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Pacific time for right now. And that's /Z Cupples. Twitter, I'm less active. That handles Z Cupples. And then Instagram, that Instagram, baby. Zac, Z-A-C, Cupples, C-P-P-L-E-S. And then I got a huge YouTube channel. If you search my name, you'll find a bazillion exercises that I detail in terms of what to do, how to do, why to do.
Awesome. Okay. Well, Zac, thank you so much for your time. This is really cool. There's a lot of really, really deep concepts here. And so there's going to be a lot for myself to research and learn up on. And I know there's going to be a lot for the listeners. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we can connect again soon in the future.
Sounds good, Juan Carlos. Appreciate you.
Thanks again for joining me, and if you enjoyed the podcast or got anything from it, please jump on iTunes and either write a review or go ahead and give me a 5-star rating. I really hope you guys are getting as much out of this as I am, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me, shoot me a message on Instagram, on Facebook, whatever social media platform that you're on, and let's continue to keep this train rolling. Next week we'll have another exciting guest, but until then, this is the Gamut of Performance Podcast.